Hi, everybody. I'm BJ from the Maine State Library. I'm the genealogy specialist. And as most of you have seen already, I can talk for quite a long time about all sorts of topics related to genealogy. And tonight I'm going to talk about immigration records. And so I've got another presentation on naturalization records. I'm only going to talk about migration, moving around records tonight. Some other time I'll do naturalization records because—
Quick question, BJ. This recording you're doing, will it be accessible later on?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So somebody's trying to get in from here and they haven't been successful so far, so.
Yeah, no, I'm hoping in the next day or two to put up a whole bunch of things at YouTube because I've got them ready to go and I just need to have the time to sit down and do it.
All righty, thanks.
So, tonight I'm just going to talk about the records people generated when they moved around. Okay. So the thing you really want to think about or put things in context is that people coming to the U.S. up until 1924 were doing it in a very different environment than since 1924. There were major changes to the laws for people coming to this country to settle in 1924. And so I'm not going to talk about those because my assumption is, for the most part, if your family came after 1924, you know enough that you're not going to be necessarily digging in the records the same way. And it gets into, there's too much detail, and we fairly soon start hitting privacy issues where things aren't available. So I'm only going to talk about people coming to this country up until 1924, okay? So the next thing you need to do is realize that how we do things now is not how we've always done them. And there was a whole lot less paperwork 150 years ago than there is now. So some other things to think about. People often use Ellis Island like it was the only place that people came in to the country, and that's not the case. It only opened in 1892. It was in business until 1954, and it was only for the Port of New York. Before 1892, there'd been Castle Garden for a while, and before that, there'd been just a customs house. There were also other ports: Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, and until the great hurricane that flattened it, Galveston, Texas was a major port, especially for people coming from Southern Europe. Boston saw heavy immigration from Ireland and the UK because it was, just like it is now, the cheapest way to get to Europe from New England is to take a plane from Boston to Dublin. And it was the same thing then. The cheapest and fastest way to get from Ireland to North America was to take a boat from somewhere in Ireland to Boston. Once railroads were invented and became widespread in the 1850s, you did have companies selling packages from non-port cities with a train ride to the port city and then the ship across the ocean. The US started requiring passenger lists in 1820, but the keeping of those, generating them, and then preserving them can be spotty. Not everybody was good at filing them. And there were no standard forms used. every customs officer could make up his own form. And could decide what information he was going to collect. And then in the 1930s, those lists from the 19th century were sent to the National Archives, and those are often online because, again, they were in the National Archives and they were microfilmed and then easily digitized. Here in Maine, one of the issues we have is land border crossings. There was much less done in the way of paperwork on ships of the 19th century, and then there was even less work done on land border crossings. The other interesting quirk is that for quite a while, the St. Albans, Vermont border crossing district covered from Minnesota to Maine. And so if you see a record for somebody who might be your ancestor, and it says it's in St. Albans, Vermont, and you thought they crossed at Detroit or somewhere here in Maine, don't rule it out, because they may well have crossed at Detroit or somewhere here in Maine, and it just gets filed as part of St. Albans, because for quite a while it was the land border district. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, makes more sense now.
Yeah. So that's just something to think about. By 1927, it had become just New York and Vermont, but before that, it had been much more of the border. Some countries did keep outgoing passenger lists. Germany and the UK did it for some periods, and they're the most complete, and they are the most available online. So you can often match up somebody leaving Bremen or one of the other German ports or one of the UK ports with the list that gets done for the arriving in the US. The other thing to know is that until World War I, passports were not really required. So people did travel without a passport. There are some passport records, and I'll talk more about those when I do the naturalization session. The US tightened its immigration laws in 1924, and Canada benefited at that point. You got a lot of people going to Canada instead. So one of the things you want to do when you're looking for the immigrant is you really want to scour all of the US sources in order to get as much as you can about their life, where they came from, an exact birth date, family members still in the old country, anything you can use to identify your family member from everybody else. Does that make sense? You know, I joke, some of you have heard me say this way too many times, but my problem when I went looking for my great-great-grandfather wasn't that I found nobody named William Patterson. It's that in mid-19th century Scotland, I found 157 William Pattersons. And so finding which one of those 157 was the right one required doing some looking other place here in the US. So you might find things like finding out, looking at their neighbors and relatives here to see if they came from the same place. Church records. Often if somebody has is from one of the church denominations that is more top down, in administration, they will come with a letter of transfer. And so many times you get a Lutheran or Episcopalian or Catholic church recording where the person is coming from in their records. So let's talk a little about the history of people coming here. Basically, until 1820, there was absolutely no regulation of who got off a boat into the US. Just, if you paid your passage and made it onto the boat and survived the voyage, and you could walk off the boat at the other end, you were let in. As I said, 1820, they start collecting passenger lists, but it's just a list of names in many cases, with often nothing more than the name on a list of who was on a ship. There really wasn't any coverage of, you didn't have a customs official really questioning people. You were just taking the list of names. In the 1820s, Prussia, among other places in Germany, made it illegal to urge anyone to emigrate to the US, to North America, which is interesting because they had a booming population and had troubles with people being poor, but they also made it very difficult to emigrate. At the time of the War of 1812, same thing, the UK made it hard for people to emigrate to the US. So a lot of people at that time did go to Canada and may have then ended up coming to the US. And they repealed that law in 1824. 1840 is when you get the start of steamships instead of sailing ships, which makes the voyage much shorter. It goes from about 3 to 3.5 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, depending on where you start in Europe, down to a week or so. And it also means that they're not reliant on the wind. It's they can keep to a much better schedule. Late 1840s, you get the Irish potato famine, which causes a huge movement of people. And to the point that in 1860, 200,000 of the 800,000 people living in New York City were Irish born. So 1 in every 4 people in New York City in 1860 was Irish born. How's that for a statistic on immigration? Then the next big thing is in 1875, Congress appoints a commissioner of immigration. So you actually have somebody in the federal government in charge of immigration. And you also get the first federal regulations on immigration, where they, for the first time, prohibit prostitutes and convicts from coming to the US. Now think about this. How many people, when they get off the boat in New York or Baltimore or wherever, if a customs official says to them, "Are you a prostitute? Are you a convict?" How many of them are going to say yes? So it's a pretty weak first approximation of any law for immigration. Another interesting statistic, in the 1880s, starting in 1880, the census in 1880 found the US population was about 50 million. And then the next decade, almost 5.5 million people came to the US. Again, 10% of the population in 10 years of immigration. Now, some of them did go back, especially, I know it was very common with Italian immigrants. You had people who would, especially young men, who would come to work for a few years and then go back to Italy. The next big change is in 1882, the US passes what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically makes it very difficult for anyone of Chinese ancestry to come here. And they, in addition to, for forbidding prostitutes and convicts to come here. They also prohibit, the federal government prohibits anyone who's a lunatic, an idiot, or those likely to become a public charge. Again, you know, if a customs official says to you, "Are you a lunatic?" Are you going to say yes? Well, maybe they will, but you know, yes, it's outdated language, but that's what they were looking for. And the public charge was pretty subjective for the customs official. Very, you know, some people did, but you know, I've heard people say, "Oh, you had to have a sponsor who guaranteed." No, as long as they thought you'd be able to make a living, they'd let you in. You know, if you were coming as a single woman who was 7.5 months pregnant, you might have a hard time coming in. But if you looked like you were a healthy 19-year-old man, they weren't going to stop you because, you know, the country needed labor at that point. So let's take a look. So in 1891, for the first time, you get an actual Bureau of Immigration. It's part of the Treasury Department. And they're in charge of all immigration stuff except the Chinese Exclusion Act. And they do, at this point, start restrictions on health. But again, it's, if you look healthy, they're not going to do much other than let you in. And at this point, because of the stuff going on with Utah and the Mormons, they add polygamists to the list of people who can't come in. Now that's a little more obvious. If you have a man coming with 2 wives and, you know, 9 children, that might be more obvious than if somebody is a convict. But that's the, when they pass that. And then a few years later, after the McKinley assassination, Congress passes a law that forbids anarchists from coming in because they're worried about the spread of political violence from Italy, Greece, and parts of Eastern Europe. But again, who's going to say, yes, I'm an anarchist? 1906 is the big year on all of this. The Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization is established, and that's where you start seeing the same forms in every port and having the same information for everybody and all of that. And then in the 1920s, the Bureau of Immigration starts a quota system that decidedly favors Northern and Western Europe. You know, France, Belgium, the UK and Scandinavia over Spain, Italy, Greece, and anywhere else in the world. And so that's the big change in the 1920s. So you have a, basically it's with everything else we talk about. In the late 19th, early 20th century, you have the development of bureaucracy and you have the development of standardization around the country. So that if you come to the port of Boston, you get asked the same questions that you get asked in New Orleans or San Francisco. At this point, the land crossing is still less monitored, especially across the top of New England. You get people from the Canadian provinces, from Quebec east, going back and forth. You get a lot of young men who come to work on a farm for a summer or do logging work for a year or two with the idea of earning money and going back to their little town in Quebec. Some went back, some didn't. So the land border crossings have fewer records than people coming here on a ship. One last thing. It's a myth that names were changed at Ellis Island. It's a myth. Sorry, never happened. They worked from the clerks at Ellis Island. Many of them were immigrants themselves. Most of them spoke multiple languages, and they worked off a list that was generated in Europe and just checked people off. They didn't have anywhere to change a name. They were processing too many people to think about that as a possibility. And so just know that in that context, if somebody says the name was changed to Ellis Island, either they're wrong or whoever told them that is using Ellis Island for sort of the whole immigrant experience, that, you know, as part of becoming an American, we anglicized our name somehow. So one of the things that comes up is, do you look for records under the original name or the anglicized name? And the answer is it depends. When we talk about naturalization records, many of those will be under the English form of the name, because by the time somebody applies for citizenship, they've been here 5 years, 15 years, 30 years, and they're using their English name. The other thing that happened was it was not unusual. It wasn't everybody, but it was also not unusual for an immigrant from, say, Poland to go and spend a couple years in England. It was cheaper to get to. It was easier to get to. They may have already had family there, learn a little English, save some money, and then come to the US. And if that's the case, they may have already anglicized their name in England. So don't rule out that possibility that one of your ancestors actually came from from Poland or Germany or Sweden via England, because it was a stop. Same thing for people who were Irish. It's amazing reading the 1851 census in Scotland and England. You know, in 1841, there are only a few people born in Ireland. By 1851, you have page after page. And they were the ones, you know, in school, we all learned about how, you know, the Irish famine immigrants were so poor. And yes, they were. But the ones who were really, really poor were like my ancestors, who made it as far as Scotland and stayed there. You know, the ones who made it to the US had a little more. So basically, up until 1924, with relatively few exceptions, if you showed up at a US port, they let you in. There wasn't really that much, you know, there wasn't any kind of system where you had to wait for paperwork or anything. So that's just so you know that. So what I'm going to do at this point is share my screen. And let's unstop my video so you don't get me looking at my screen. So let's take a look. Here are the St. Albans border crossings. And so I'll randomly put in my last name to see what we can find. And as you can see, you get people who are coming. So let's take, you know what? This is my grandfather, I think. Let's take a look. So we'll go in here. I think this is my grandfather. Come on. Let's take a look. So yeah, so this is the St. Albans district, but you see he's coming through the Port of Buffalo. And this is indeed my grandfather. So here we have Edward J. Jameson, accompanied, this is his brother. And they give English speaking, Scotch. That's interesting. I don't think my grandfather was ever naturalized as a Canadian, although at this point, Canadian citizenship and British citizenship weren't that separated. They give their sister, Bella, wife of Alec Patterson, that's his previous trip to the US. This is wrong. He came in 1910, not 1909. They're going to a friend. And so this is the sort of stuff you get on the border crossings. And when you have this, if you go under tools, you can turn it to the left a couple times, and then you can, and I'm not quite sure what BSI was at that point. But he last left, so, but notice medical certificate, good. And so this is typical of what you get for land crossings. And this looks like it's, trying to see what year this is done. I know it needs to be after 1924 because there's a reference to that there. It doesn't really give you a good answer on the date. But this is a typical land crossing record. And as I said, he's going from Toronto to Buffalo, but it's still part of the St. Albans district. Okay, that makes sense to everybody? So let's get out of that. I'm going to go to Ancestry. And let's go to Immigration and Travel. And Passenger Lists. So they do have the Ellis Island here at Ancestry. Here's the Massachusetts ones from starting in 1820 for Boston. So let's take a look at this, just so you see a typical early record. And when this comes up, if I can see around the cat, Scout, this is not going to work. You need to come sit in my lap. If you want to be close to me, this is better. I promise. And it's taking too long to load. Oh well. We'll wait. Okay, so I know if I type in the name Murphy, I'm going to find somebody coming into Boston, right? And I'm going to put the arrival as 1850, so we get a nice early one. And so here we have in 1850, we have Daniel Murphy. And let's take a look at this ship's list. And Boston was actually keeping pretty good records at this point compared to some of the other ports. They have enough traffic that they have a form. And your forms are, the downside of a form is they never write extra information in them, but the upside is they usually fill out most of the blanks, so you don't get missing information. So here we have a family named Murphy. This is coming from Liverpool. You should notice that they're good Irish name, but they're coming from Liverpool, which was often the port that those who were Irish left from, to Boston. The ship's name, the Parliament. And here's the family. You have Daniel, Catherine, and then it looks like these are probably their children, Peter, Patrick, and Mary. Country to which they belong is Ireland, where they want to become inhabitants, United States. And that's the passenger list. So many of these pre-1890 passenger lists are very hard to figure out if you've got the right family or not. Just because of this kind of, there's just not, almost everyone coming from Ireland was called a laborer. So there's no occupational distinction. There's no breakdown of Ireland. Who knows if these ages are really right? Because, if these are actually their children instead of their siblings, Catherine was a little young to have any of them, and so on. Does that make sense to everybody? But sometimes you get lucky and you will have somebody with an unusual name. So for example, one of the ways I found my William Patterson is that his daughter was named Jemima, which was more common in, I think they arrived in 1888. Yeah, I think this is her. So, even in the 1880s, yeah, this is them. So, again, for some reason they said none on the occupation for this entire page, pretty much. But you have the family here, and I know it. This is a case where I have other evidence that this is them as well. But fortunately, it's not just Margaret and Jesse and Isabella. There's a Jemima in there that helps me. Her sister's, it's spelled Joanna, but they pronounced it Jonna, and it's where my Aunt Joni got her name, which is where I got my middle name. So I have some fondness for this family because, I was kind of named after this sister. I'm actually descended from a sister who stayed in Scotland. So as you can see, you're not getting that much information at this point on the passenger list. It does get better. Let me show you a couple better ones. So we'll do a new search. We're going to search immigration and travel again. Now we'll find the real record of my grandfather first coming. And he was born in 1894 and arrived in 1910. And this is a case where you want to check everything. I'd grown up on the story of him coming over to Canada with his three brothers to join their older sister Bella and her new husband, and I'd never checked it. And I was helping a friend with the Ellis Island site, and I put him in hoping to catch him on one of his trips back and forth to Scotland, and lo and behold, I find this one, this record. And here he is coming over in 1910. These they've got somewhat in alphabetical order, which is nice. Age 16. I don't know why he gave his occupation as printer. British citizen, born in Leith. His father, this column is the most recent, the closest relative still in the home country. And so this is how I know it's really him, is that's the right name and address. And then I look at this, I go, Ohio, Cleveland, I didn't know we had any family there. Well, by this point, you're getting a second page. And so he is on line 13, because they often don't line up. You need to know which line you're on. and he paid for his own passage. He's got $25 with him, and he's going to join an aunt, Mrs. William Wolfe, in Cleveland. His health is good. He's not an anarchist. He's not admitting to be either a polygamist at the age of 16 or an anarchist. And his health is good. He's 5'1", and then it confirms his birthplace. So, by 1906, you're getting this kind of form, so that you are getting the standardized information, you're getting more detailed information, and it from there, it helps to then find other information. They're asking who they're joining, but this is not somebody who was guaranteeing they'd take care of them. It's just, are you joining somebody? So, and it does ask if they've been in the country before. And you will see that you get some people who have been here, gone back, and then come back. In fact, one of the women I know from the Strathclyde program I did is actually doing a study for her PhD in sort of history and genealogy, looking at these people who went back and seeing if she can find any common denominators or anything. So let's look at a couple more of these. Let's back up one more. You also get some UK and Ireland incoming passenger lists. Those are not if somebody is, they don't list non-UK, they don't list UK citizens. That's only non-citizens. Here's from Hamburg. These are the outgoing, and I can't think of a good name off the top of my head, so we'll just choose one of these. And we'll go to a random page. And they're tough to read in many cases. It's very European handwriting. But these have been indexed. So if you're looking for somebody, so here's somebody, Taube Gelb, and the information. They're in German because it's from Germany. So have fun if this is where your ancestry is. But they did keep the good records. It's just not easy to read them. You will get in some places distinctions between those who paid for their own passage and those who had help. So here you have, for Australia, they often did, if people were being assisted to emigrate, whether by the justice system or an Australian end incentive to emigrate, you will get lists of those separated from those who paid their own passage. They have a lot of these. Here you have the people who've left Sweden. Wars disrupt immigration, but they also cause it. So, numbers went down during World War I, but immediately after World War I, you got a lot of people move around. So, they both disrupt immigration and prompt it. So that's worth knowing as sometimes as the reason for things. So as I said, passenger lists, there are lots of them. Hawaii's records are fairly good for a good chunk of the 19th century. So if you have relatives who were mariners, it's probably worth checking the Hawaii passenger list to see if they spent some time in Hawaii. Again, Minnesota, I expect you have sort of your first, why do they have passenger lists? Well, it's people coming up the St. Lawrence and up the Great Lakes. These are interesting. These are dealing with, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, you've got these about looking at the people who probably weren't supposed to be here. So let's put in a last name and see what we come up with. So, so here's one. This is, these are still on microfilm at the archives in Seattle, or sorry, in San Francisco. So those are an interesting historical bit of information. I was looking to see. So, you know, there are a lot of these, some of them are very little files. I mean, this is not many people arrived at Mississippi's ports in that time period. But then you get this one, you know, where it's alien arrivals to various ports, and it's almost 4.5 million records. So the records, as I said, vary in quality and quantity at various points. Before 1820, unless you're looking at records that have been reconstructed for famous ships, you know, early Plymouth, the Winthrop Fleet in Boston, William Penn's ships going to Pennsylvania, those have been reconstructed. There are no originals of those. You know, even the list of who was on the Mayflower is essentially reconstructed from later writings. So you know, you're not going to find passenger lists for basically before 1820 for the U.S. And from 1820 to the 1890s, as I said, you know, there's no standardized form, so what you get varies. You know, if you have a board clerk, you may have asked more questions. If you have somebody who's doing a lot of other things, he probably just took the passenger list that the ship captain gave him and stuck it in the file. So it's hit or miss, and it's hard when you have somebody with fairly common names when you've only got, you know, maybe an age and a country of origin to know whether it's the right person. So that's sort of what you get in a nutshell. And I will tell you that it sometimes takes some really creative spelling to find these records between the handwriting. And, you know, yes, at Ellis Island, they hired people who spoke the languages the immigrants were speaking. But, you know, if somebody came into Boston speaking Lithuanian and they didn't happen to have somebody who spoke Lithuanian on duty that day, you can get some pretty creative spellings. So keep that in mind. So stopping the share and starting my video up again. Any questions at this point?
Not so much a question, but just a comment. I mean, of course, I've heard most of those things about Ellis Island, but there was one thing I had not heard until you said it. You pointed out that when we were doing the in the library meeting about this, and you pointed out that there weren't agencies keeping track of people at that time. So it didn't even make sense for people to be saying that it was Ellis Island that changed their name, because who's keeping track of that? Nobody's going to come hunt them down. Once they leave, they could do whatever they wanted, basically.
Yeah.
So that was a really good point.
Yeah, because, you know, even if somebody had been renamed, once they walked out of Ellis Island, they could go back to their original name. That's what their paperwork was in, if they had paperwork.
I mean, the only thing I could think of is, I mean, would any of them have not understood that and maybe been too fearful? But again, it goes back to, like you said, most of the time there was somebody with their language.
Right, and there was nowhere to record it. You know, there are miles of paperwork saved from the Bureau of Immigration, most of which some researcher has looked at some point in the last 100 years, and there's not a single record of a name change, which tells you something. And it's funny because this will come up in various groups I'm in at Facebook, and somebody's, you know, my grandfather said his grandfather's name was changed to Ellis Island, and yes, I have proof. And then it's like, well, what is it? And it's like, well, my great grandfather said it, and you know, there just isn't proof. You do get cases in naturalization records that I'll show you when I do that as a topic, where you have somebody's original name and their Americanized name. But as I said, in those cases, they've been here, you know, minimum of 5 years to apply for citizenship in most cases. There's some exceptions, like if you served in the military, it would fast track an application. But other than that, yeah. So, but that's one of the big myths of American genealogy, is the whole names change at Ellis Island.
Yeah, a friend of mine, she insists that her uncle told her that his name was changed. Like, she's hearing it from the person himself, but I'm thinking what happened is maybe for whatever reason he chose to Americanize it, and then maybe felt like he shouldn't. I don't know if there's a feeling of shame there or just not wanting to admit that, but anyway, he blames it on Ellis Island. So
yeah, and first of all, if he came after 1954, it wasn't Ellis Island.
No, it could have been much earlier than that, because she's in her 70s, so then he would have been obviously.
But you know, I'm sure you will eventually find the record in his original name.
Yeah.
BJ, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you cleared up something for me. In the mid 1990s, I was back in Washington, D.C., so I went to the U.S. Archives. And in one afternoon, I have a grandfather that came from Northeast Poland / Lithuania / Belarus. And within one afternoon, she found the card in the St. Albans file and the passenger manifest. And so I walked away with that, and I thought, wow, I really hit a home run here. But it always confused me, because my mother and my aunt would say, well, he went to Montreal. And so the St. Albans manifest, records were just that. They were just records, right? They weren't,
they were the border crossing records.
Okay. And then my cousin, who later on gave me a letter of intent, and he ended up in Detroit from Montreal, which makes sense based on what you're saying.
Yeah,
right?
Because and you need to remember that pre-World War II, up until World War II, transport in North America, for the vast majority, was either by ship or by some kind of train or streetcar from 1850 until about 1940. I mean, my father tells of growing up in Buffalo and being able to take the streetcar all the way to Toronto. Because what would happen would be one streetcar system would end, and then you'd walk a block or two and get the far end of the next one. I mean, you can still do this. You can go from Philadelphia to certain New Jersey transit stations in New Jersey, and then on to New York City. So you can take Philadelphia public transit into New Jersey, get off at the last stop, cross the street, and get on to New Jersey Transit that takes you into New York City. And that's a system that used to be much more widespread. but a lot of things, and a lot of the trains followed the waterways because that's where it was easy to put a train track in. Because you're not going to have a hit. You don't have up and down a hill for a river.
Yeah.
And so that's where, here in the East, where a lot of the train tracks went in, was along rivers. I mean, I know it happened in Philadelphia. There's a train that goes up the Hudson from New York City that eventually ends at Montreal.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
And
it
you
makes
also then
sense
got
now.
trains
My
that went
cousin and I have been arguing back and forth. I'm going to send her a copy of this video or a link to it when you get it out there. It clarifies a lot. I mean, he's got Riga on his letter of intention, which makes sense because we know he was in Riga based on a passport we found. But he came from Northeast Poland, with, quote, Russia, unquote. Pale settlement, basically.
Yeah, and that whole north central part of Europe changed. I was helping a friend whose family is Jewish, and I forget exactly which town she was in, but she lived her whole life for like 87 years in one town and lived in 4 different countries over the course of her life.
Yeah.
In the late.
That's what happened there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
And so, but and Riga is one of those ports. They may have come directly, but they may have also gone from Riga to Liverpool to Montreal.
He came out of Antwerp. Yeah.
Okay, because if you look at the geography, you'll see he may well have actually taken a train to Antwerp instead of going around Denmark.
Well, the story we grew up hearing, he was smuggled out in a hay wagon.
Well, there's that too.
Now, your mentioning of that brings up something I was going to talk about too, BJ, is that, of course, one of the problems of looking at trying to find your person amongst the many other people, like in my case, it's a William Crawford, not exactly an unusual name. I know where he was born because I've got his NAT record, but on the immigration records, when they're naming where they're from, it might be where they actually originated, or it might be, as you said, Liverpool was one of those places where, that's not where the Irish people came from, but a lot of them may have left from there. So that's definitely a huge problem. That's for me, especially where my William came over. I think it was maybe around the 1840s-ish. So of course, things are pretty sparse, the information, and he didn't come with other relatives that I know of. So
yeah,
where you came from, and then the name, the time, and a bunch of them came into New York. So really, it's like, I don't know that there's any way to narrow that down, but that is definitely a huge problem that a lot of people have, as you pointed out.
So yeah, it's I can't tell you how many people have gone into this, have come into my office and said, I can't find the immigration record. Why am I not finding something that looks like I showed you with my grandfather with the 2 pages of detailed information? And it turns out the ancestor came over in 1843, and I'm like, you're going to be lucky to find his name on a piece of paper.
Yeah. And if you find his name, you'll find a bunch of others with the same name. Good luck figuring out which one is him.
Right. And that's and it's interesting the extent to which how often in later paperwork, original immigration dates are off, whether it's the census or, as you saw, I showed you the record for my grandfather where, 15 years later, he's got the wrong year. He says 1909 instead of 1910 in 1924 or 5. Somehow that I can't tell you how many times I've seen that on the census where it turns out the year is off by anywhere up to 10 years.
Yeah, I know when I've been looking at them with anybody, And I'll say, oh, great, it does give a year, but take that with a grain of salt. It at least gives you kind of a time frame to work with. So still go look for it and around that time and then expand from there. But yeah, don't trust that number.
Yeah, it's, so that's just a warning that in some ways, more than anything, is the thing I see that's the most often wrong on the standard records we use. You know, census and other sort of core genealogy records. That's the thing that I most often am going to say, don't trust that number.
Oh, even more than the birth dates.
Yeah. So I'm looking to see, there's a way, somewhere I have a list of how the St. Albans district contracted, but I'm not seeing it here.
That was new to me as well. So I'm glad you mentioned that because I also was not aware of that.
Yeah,
Where were the records physically housed?
I think they were originally at the at each little border station and then sent to St. Albans and then eventually to the National Archives. At least that's what I've read. I have not.
Interesting.
Oh, here's a good, here we go. I'm going to put, this is an article by Michael Leclerc up at, and it may not exactly answer the question, but he's one of the big names in French Canadian genealogy. So I would trust, this is at American Ancestors about St. Albans. So it gives you, I don't think he talks about how it contracts. But it talks a little about going through Canada. And then, and how, you know, the US system, as it changed, Canada became easier, especially if you were coming from the UK and Ireland and so on. So, oh, I sent that, sorry, I only sent that to one person. Let me send it to everybody. So he knows what he's talking about. So I would trust his commentary on St. Albans. So any other questions?
Well, I had a question. Who is the person living in Lewiston? Have they left?
No, Claire's still here.
At the beginning, somebody said they were from Lewiston.
Yeah,
That's Claire?